Today I'm going to show you 3 ways to mix colours in watercolour. Hi everyone, welcome back. This video is about different ways of mixing watercolour paint. I'm not going to go into colour theory and talk about what colours to mix because that's a whole other topic that needs a video or 2 of its own. But I will show you my physical process of mixing watercolours. So number 1 is mixing colours on the palette. Number 2 is mixing colours on the paper. And number 3 is glazing colours. Okay, method 1, mixing colours on the palette. Now this is a method that I have to admit that I don't use very often. I will mix greys if I need a grey, and I'll mix black sometimes if I need a lot of it. I might mix 2 colours together if the tube colour that I have isn't quite what I want, but other than that, I don't often mix colours on my palette. I tend to use method 2, which I'll show you soon. Okay, so let's have a look at mixing colours on the palette. If you've just squirted your paint out, it will be wet and easy to pick up with a wet brush. If it's been on there for a while, I'll just give it a quick refresh with some water just to soften it slightly. Then I wet my palette where I'm going to be mixing the paint, and I use my wet brush just to move the paint from the paint well onto my mixing palette. And then I stir it around so that it dissolves the pigment. So then without washing my brush out, I'll pick up the other colour and I'll mix that in. Now I don't wash the brush out, I try to remember not to do that because if I do it just keeps diluting the mixture too much. I try to also mix up a darker colour than I need, and then if I need it to be lighter all I have to do is just add some more water. Now sometimes when I'm painting I might put the paint on the paper darker than what I want without meaning to. So if I do that, I just wet my brush again. And then I just spread it out and dilute it with the water from the brush. Couple of things to remember. Always mix more than you need. You don't want to run out of mixed paint halfway through a wash. It's also a good idea to start with the colour that dominates. By that I mean if you want to mix a light green from blue and yellow, start with yellow and then add the blue. Or if you want to mix a dark green, then start with the blue and add the yellow. So if I want to make a light green, I'll put the water in my palette and then I'll use the yellow first. I mix the yellow in. Dissolve the paint with the water, and then I'll pick up some blue and I'll put that into the yellow. So that gives me the light colour. So if I want a dark green, I'll do the opposite. I'll put the blue in first. I'll mix that with the water. And then I'll pick up the yellow. And then I get a dark green. You might remember this cow painting from my last video about stretching watercolour paper. This was the paper that I had stretched the day before, and you saw me put the washi tape and then the masking tape on it. Well, I finished the painting this week, and look how flat that paper is. Now, I've made a full-length tutorial of this painting. It's on Patreon now if you're interested, and the link is in the description. So when I painted the cow painting, the main colour that I used was a grey that I mixed. And I just mixed this from French Ultramarine and Burnt Sienna. So once I get the colour I want, I can just use a wet brush to pick it up. And that gives me that lovely soft grey. Okay, method 2, mixing colours on the paper. Now this is the method of mixing colours that I use most often when I paint. And this involves working wet on wet, and it's an expressive way of mixing colours. So this is what I do a lot of. I'll put one colour on the paper. Sometimes I might be working on damp paper and other times I'll be working on dry paper. Usually depends on the size of whatever it is that I'm painting. And before that paint dries, I'll pick up another colour and I'll drop that onto the damp paint. And it just blends and mixes with the paint that's there. You never know quite what it's going to look like when it dries, which is part of the excitement of painting with watercolour for me. So when I painted the background on the cow, I wet the paper first, and then I put one colour on. This colour is Winsor Violet. And then I used some French Ultramarine. And the two colours just blended on the paper together. So this is the French Ultramarine now. And I didn't just do this on the background. When I painted the cow itself, I also used this method. I painted one colour on, and then I'd drop in a second colour while that paint was damp, and I'd let the colours merge on the paper. So here I've just painted the grey onto the side of the neck. It's still damp. Now I've got some Winsor Violet on my brush, and I drop that onto the damp paper. And then the two colours just blend together. So here's a little tree that I'm going to paint freehand, just really quickly, just to show you what I do with the colours. I've just got a green there that I'm establishing the shape with, working on dry paper. Then I pick up a darker colour. While that green's still damp, I drop the dark green in, and then I pick up the yellow and drop that in. And I've got the three colours there, just mixing together on the paper. And I just use my brush just to push the paint around where I want it. But I try not to fuss with it too much. So I hope that gives you the idea of mixing the paint on the paper by working wet on wet. The third method of mixing colours is called glazing. Now that's where you paint a colour, you let it dry, and then you paint another colour over the top to change the colour. Now it's technically not mixing the colours, but it's a good way to change and combine your colours. So before I show you how I use this method on my paintings, I'll just show you what it is here on a scrap piece of paper. So I'm just painting some French Ultramarine here, just onto a piece of Arches paper, and this is Permanent Rose. Now I'm going to let these two strips of colour dry. So they're dry now. Now I'll just get some Winsor Lemon. I'll paint it over the blue. And where it touches the blue, I get a green colour. So over the top of the Permanent Rose, I'll just paint some French Ultramarine. And where the two colours cross one another, I should get a purple. It's always a good idea to use transparent colours when you're using this method. If you do happen to use opaque colours, just make sure they're watered down well. One way I use this method is when I paint leaves. I'll put a wash of transparent yellow on the leaves before I paint my greens, and this gives the leaves a lovely glow. So here on my eucalyptus leaf painting, the first thing I did was paint a layer of Winsor Lemon over the top of all the leaves. And then I let that layer of paint dry. So then I came back with my greens and I just painted over the top of the yellow paint. And that just makes the leaves glow with light. Sometimes when I've finished painting my leaves, I'll paint another layer of transparent yellow over the top, just to make them glow even further. So you can see that one that I'm painting now is quite a bit brighter than the one on the left. When I paint my birds, I'll often use this glazing technique on the feathers. A lot of people ask me how I get the feathers on my crows to glow with light. Both of these paintings have sold and I don't have them anymore, but some of the work on the feathers was glazing one colour over the top of another. I can show you an example of using this method on this little fantail that I painted this year. So here on the tail, I'm just painting some Winsor Violet. I'm painting on damp paper here. So when I've finished filling the feather in with this, I'm just going to let it dry. So that dried. Now I'm re-wetting it with water because I want to work on damp paper just over the top of the purple. So I let it dry and now I've re-wet it with water. And now I'm ready for my next colour. So I mixed up a black with 3 colours and now I'm using this black mix over the top of the violet. So I completely covered it with the black mix and you can still see the violet showing through. But now what I want to do is reveal the violet even further just by dropping some water on, which will create a watercolour bloom. So there's 3 ways of mixing colours when you paint with watercolour. I use all 3 in any given painting, but as I said earlier, my preferred method, or the one that I use most often, is method 2, mixing colour on the paper. Experiment with them yourself and use them in all of your paintings, and let me know in the comments what method you prefer to use. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and I'll see you soon with a new tutorial. Okay, method 2, mixing colours on the paper. Now this is the method of mixing colours that I use most often when I paint. This involves working wet on wet and I can't say expressive. Sorry about the magpie.